Most people picture drug kingpins and mob bosses as Italian-American white people, but the African-American side had their share just as ruthless and vicious as any drug organization had. These men prospered off the misery and horror they brought to the community and cared little for the destruction they caused. Labeled in history as the most evil, their dangerous lifestyles destroyed too many to count. Peter Pistol Pete Rawlik. Pistol Pete acquired a reputation as a ruthless killer who made millions in the drug game in the late 80s and early 90s. He was known for busting his guns with no conscience, a modern-day Billy the Kid. Pistol Pete was quick to draw and quicker to blast someone. He was known as one of the most feared and powerful men in New York during the crack era and could get people killed on his word alone. He turned his neighborhood red in more ways than one and continued to exert his influence even after his incarceration. Tied as a boy to heroin kingpin Nicky Barnes, Peter Rawlik came up in the game in the projects of the Bronx. Amidst the 1980s crack epidemic, he earned his nickname Pistol Pete after starting his own gang, Sex, Money, Murder. Rawlik would ultimately confess to pulling the trigger on many of his rivals, but justice wouldn't stop his killer reputation. Once behind bars, he continued to orchestrate murders. At the age of 25, in order to avoid the death penalty, Pistol Pete Rawlik accepted a plea bargain of life behind bars and solitary confinement. He is serving multiple life sentences at ADX Florence, the BOP Supermax prison with limited communication. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Pimp, drug lord, numbers racketeer, and peddler of protection, Johnson traveled with a straight razor and had no aversion to using it. He slashed those who crossed him and is said to have destroyed a guy's eyeball with a spoon. Yet when it was his time to go, in 1968, he died of a heart attack. Johnson was eating a breakfast of fried chicken and eggs at Wells Restaurant in Harlem when cholesterol accomplished what his adversaries could not. He was out on a $50,000 bail stemming from a narcotics rap as he ate his last meal. He capitalized on the fact that the numbers game was big business in the 30s. It was essentially an illegal lottery in which thousands of locals bet from a nickel to a dollar on a three-digit number from 000 to 999. He controlled much of Harlem and maintained a strong relationship with mob kingpin Charles Lucky Luciano. While Bumpy curried favor with the community, he is said to have paid rent for the down and out, bought school clothes for financially struggling children, and put them through college. The U.S. Attorney described Bumpy as the most vicious and dangerous criminal in Harlem. Friends and relatives maintain that Bumpy profited from sales of heroin in Harlem, but that he personally did not handle the drugs. Francis Big Frank Nitti Usher. Big Frank Nitti ran the city's block mob in the late 1970s and saw his infamy and both his reputation on the street and in the local media soar to meteoric heights. He was mentored and staked in underworld affairs by the notorious Giacalone brothers of Motown's Italian mafia known as the Tocco Zerilli crime family. From 1975 until his conviction for a notorious triple beheading in 1980, Usher and his Murder Road gang ruled the city streets. Authorities tabbed him as a suspect in at least 15 slayings. As a teenager growing up on the East Side, Usher ran errands for Detroit Mafia street bosses Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, the men the FBI considered responsible for the famed disappearance and murder of Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa. When Usher started his own African-American crime family in the early 1970s, modeled after the Italian mafia, the Giacalones financed and backed the venture dubbed Murder Row. The syndicate headquartered at the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club in Detroit's Midtown area. The Giacalones used the Murder Row crew for muscle work well into the 1980s according to the DEA records. Big Frank Nitti's empire of drugs, gambling, prostitution, and extortion blanketed the city per federal documents chronicling Usher's ascent. Usher's main enforcer and street boss Adolph Doc Holliday Powell managed Murder Row affairs from the social club, while Usher usually spent his days on the city's west side at his Black Orchid Strip Club. Most evenings the crew would convene at Mr. Kelly's Lounge or the 19th Hole Bar on the east side. Usher was convicted and later acquitted of playing a role in one of the most high-profile homicides in Detroit history, the July 1979 Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club massacre, where 3 victims were shot execution style and then beheaded as a result of a power struggle in Usher's organization. In 2015, he was arrested for for a hand-to-hand heroin sale but had the charges dropped before trial. Francis Big Frank Nitti Usher died of a stroke at age 78. Demetrius Flannery. The Black Mafia family was founded in 1989 in Detroit by brothers Demetrius Big Meech Flannery and Terry Southwest T Flannery, and by 2000 had established cocaine distribution sales throughout the United States through their Los Angeles-based drugstores and direct links to Mexican drug cartels. The Black Mafia family operated from two main hubs, one in Atlanta for distribution run by Demetrius Flannery, and one in Los Angeles to handle incoming shipments from Mexico run by Terry Flannery. The Black Mafia family under Demetrius Flannery entered the hip-hop music business as BMF Entertainment in the early 2000s as a front organization to launder money from cocaine sales and to legitimize itself. BMF Entertainment served as a promoter for several high-profile hip-hop artists. Demetrius Flannery and the Black Mafia family became famous in hip-hop popular culture for their highly extravagant lifestyles. BMF operated 5 stash houses in the Atlanta area. Approximately every 10 days, vehicles would arrive with 100 to 150 kilograms of cocaine packed in secret compartments. Workers at the stash houses were paid to unload the drugs and store them. Customers who ordered would call in and say they had their vehicle ready, meaning a transportation vehicle to put the narcotics in. Depending on the size of their order, they were directed to a certain stash house where they would pull in, go inside, and hand over money in $5,000 bundles. The cocaine was usually sold at $20,000 per kilogram. The same vehicles would then be filled with cash to be sent back to the Mexican sources of supply. Workers inside the stash houses had certain duties, such as counting bulk amounts of cash, usually in the millions. Other people were packaging the cocaine for customers. BMF also received drugs through large containers at the airport, which they picked up and delivered to stash houses. In 2005, the DEA indicted members of the Black Mafia family, ultimately securing convictions by targeting the Flannery brothers under the Continuing Criminal Enterprise statute, and both were sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. Subsequent indictments eventually targeted over 1,000 members of the organization. Prosecutors allege that the Black Mafia family made over $270 million in the course of their operations. Demetrius Flannery is serving out his sentence at Federal Correction Institution Sheridan and is scheduled for release on May 5, 2032, around his 64th birthday. Terry Flannery was released to home confinement on May 5, 2020, after being granted a compassionate release due to health ailments and an effort from the Federal Bureau of Prisons to release certain inmates in order to limit the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic within federal prisons. Nicky Barnes. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was an American crime boss active in New York City during the 1970s. In 1972, Barnes formed the Council, a 7-man African-American organized crime syndicate that controlled a significant part of the heroin trade in the Harlem area of New York City. Barnes led the Council into an international drug trafficking ring in partnership with the Italian-American Mafia until his arrest in 1977. Barnes was sentenced to life imprisonment, eventually becoming a federal informant that led to the collapse of the Council in 1977. In 1972, to deal more effectively with other black gangsters in Harlem, Barnes founded the Council, a 7-man organization where it settled disputes among the criminals and handled distribution problems and other drug trade-related issues. According to DEA records, Barnes's operation in 1976 consisted of 7 lieutenants who each controlled a dozen mid-level distributors who in turn supplied upwards of 40 street-level dealers each. Barnes's net worth had reached over $50 million at the height of his career. A New York Times article estimated Barnes purchased hundreds of tailor-made suits, Italian shoes, coats, and jewelry, which alone was valued at over $7 million. During his time, Barnes had become the dominant drug lord in Harlem and was given the name Mr. Untouchable after successfully beating numerous charges and arrests. The Council also employed contract killers. According to Barnes, while in prison, he discovered that his assets were not being maintained and the Council had stopped paying his attorney's fees. Barnes discovered that one of his fellow council members, Guy Fisher, was having an affair with Barnes's mistress. In response, Barnes became a federal informant. He passed along a list of 109 names, 5 of them council members, along with his wife's name, implicating them all in illegal activities related to the the heroin trade. Barnes helped to indict 44 other traffickers, 16 of whom were ultimately convicted. Barnes died from cancer on June 18, 2012. However, because he was under witness protection, his death was not reported under his birth name, and news of his death only became known in June 2019. Barnes was portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr. in the film American Gangster. Dillard Morrison Sr. Dillard Morrison Sr., known as Red Dillard, was an American mob boss and enforcer in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. Once called the most dangerous man in the country by federal law enforcement agents, Morrison's underworld resume included running a multi-million-dollar heroin ring, enforcing, pimping, extortion, and engaging in shootouts with rivals like Bumpy Johnson. A Robin Hood-like figure in the Harlem community, Morrison's exploits with crime, women, and music are legendary. Though he would spend decades behind bars over the course of his life, Morrison was never convicted of murder. After deciding menial labor was not for him, Morrison quickly earned underworld credibility by robbing craps players and numbers runners in Harlem, growing into a bona fide gangster in the late 1930s. Before long, Morrison became a major force within the Harlem criminal world. Morrison came to the attention of the shot callers of that time, men like Big Joe Richards, the undisputed boss of the Seaboard Negro Rackets. When Morrison was asked to become the right-hand man for Big Joe, he agreed. In the mid-1940s, Morrison split with Big Joe and began buying heroin wholesale from Italian mobster Lucky Luciano, who imported it from Turkey via Sicily. Morrison then handed off the product to drug runners who resold it in points further south and west of New York. Morrison also worked as a pimp and earned a reputation as both a dashing ladies' man and a philanderer. Then for 3 years he had no problems with the law. He had learned to intimidate victims so well that many of the assaults credited to him never reached the police. As Morrison's business grew, so did his profile. His name began to turn up in local newspapers, both for opulent parties he threw and for his criminal activities. On May 4, 1950, Morrison was arrested by federal officers on charges of possession and sale of narcotics. Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Morrison returned in 1955 with promises of going straight. Trying to cope with the death of his wife, he spent his nights at clubs. There were more shootouts, bar brawls, and a drug deal set up by a federal agent that landed him back in jail for 10 more years. Released in 1974, Morrison moved to Los Angeles and continued his life as a drug dealer even as he approached his 60th birthday. By 1979, Morrison was back in jail for the last time after a girlfriend testified against him and he was convicted of drug charges. He died of bladder cancer in prison in 1989. Frank Matthews. Known as the one that got away, Frank Larry Matthews, also known as the Black Caesar, Mark IV, and Pee-wee, is an American drug trafficker who sold heroin and cocaine throughout the eastern United States from 1965 to 1972. At the peak of his career, he operated in 21 states and supplied drug dealers throughout every region of the country. The DEA ranks him as one of the top 10 drug traffickers in U.S. history, and he is estimated to have had $20 million in savings. He also escaped justice and vanished. After a short stint in prison, Matthews moved to the Bedford area of New York City and became a barber, collecting numbers as he had in Philadelphia, as well as working as a collector and an enforcer. It dawned on Matthews that the money he was making from the numbers racket was small fry compared to what he could be making in the illegal drug trade, more specifically heroin. In the early 1960s, the main supply of wholesale heroin was the Italian mafia through their famed French connection. Matthews decided to approach two of the families, the Bonanno and Gambino families, but they refused to grant his request and he was turned down. Refusing to give up, Matthews then contacted a guy who ran the numbers racket in Harlem. A meeting was set up between Matthews and Rolando Gonzalez Nunez, who was godfather of the Cuban Mafia in New York and also a major player in the wholesale cocaine business. This relationship expanded into a lucrative and expansive drug trafficking network. Gonzalez began sending Matthews large loads of cocaine and heroin from South America. By the early 1970s, the Matthews organization was handling multi-million-dollar loads of heroin. The IRS estimated that he earned over $10 million in 1972. According to the DEA, Matthews controlled the cutting, packaging, and sale of heroin in every major East Coast city. In New York City, he operated two massive drug mills in Brooklyn, one nicknamed the Ponderosa and the other named the OK Corral. Both locations were heavily fortified and secured with walls reinforced with steel and concrete and protected by guards with machine guns. Besides controlling the retail sale of heroin, the organization supplied other major dealers throughout the East Coast with multi-kilogram shipments for up to $26,000 per kilogram. He led a flamboyant lifestyle with luxury homes, vehicles, and clothing, along with prime seats at sporting events and trips to Las Vegas to launder money and gamble. Matthews hosted an African American and Hispanic drug dealers summit in Atlanta in 1971 and another in Las Vegas in 1972 to discuss how to break the American mafia control of heroin importation. In January 1973, the DEA arrested Matthews in Las Vegas on charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute heroin and cocaine. A federal magistrate originally set the bail at $5 million, the highest bail amount ever set at that time. He was indicted on 6 counts of tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute heroin and cocaine and faced 50 years in prison. On July 2, 1973, Matthews was scheduled to appear in a Brooklyn courthouse but never showed. Matthews allegedly took $20 million and fled the country with his girlfriend. He left behind his common-law wife, their 3 sons, and their Staten Island mansion and was never seen again. The FBI placed a $20,000 bounty on Matthews, the highest set by the federal agency since the FBI placed the same amount for the capture of bank robber John Dillinger. Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was an American drug trafficker who operated in Harlem during the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was known for cutting out middlemen in the drug trade and buying heroin directly from his source in Southeast Asia. Lucas boasted that he smuggled heroin using the coffins of dead American servicemen. In 1976, Lucas was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 70 years in prison, but after becoming an informant, he and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program. In 1981, his federal and state prison sentences were reduced to time served plus lifetime parole. In 1984, he was convicted on drug charges and was released from prison in 1991. At a young age in his hometown of Greensboro, North Carolina, Lucas got into a fight with a white man, and fearing harsh retribution, Frank fled to New York City at the behest of his mother, who feared that he would either be imprisoned for life or lynched. Once in Harlem, he quickly began indulging in petty crime and pool hustling before he was taken under the wing of gangster Bumpy Johnson. After Johnson's death, Lucas came to the realization that to be successful he would have to break the monopoly that the Italian mafia held in New York. Traveling to Bangkok, Thailand, he eventually made his way to Jack's American Star Bar, an R&R hangout for black soldiers. It was here that he met former U.S. Army Sergeant Leslie Ike Atkinson, who was married to one of Lucas's cousins. Lucas is quoted as saying, "Ike knew everyone over there, every black guy in the Army from cooks on up." Lucas only trusted relatives and close friends from North Carolina to handle his various heroin operations. Lucas thought they were less likely to steal from him and be tempted by various vices in the big city. He stated his heroin, Blue Magic, was 98 to 100% pure when shipped from Thailand. Lucas has been quoted as saying that his worth was something like $52 million, most of it in Cayman Island banks. This large profit margin allowed him to buy property all over the country, including office buildings in Detroit and apartments in Los Angeles and Miami. He also bought a ranch of several thousand acres in North Carolina on which he ranged 300 head of Black Angus cattle, including a breeding bull worth $125,000. Lucas rubbed shoulders with the elite of the entertainment, political, and criminal worlds, stating later that he had met Howard Hughes at one of Harlem's best clubs in his day. Though he owned several mink and chinchilla coats and other accessories, Lucas much preferred to dress casually and corporately so as not to attract attention to himself. When he was arrested in the mid-1970s, all of Lucas's assets were seized. Lucas stated, "The properties in Chicago, Detroit, Miami, North Carolina, and Puerto Rico, they took everything. My lawyer told me they couldn't take the money in the offshore accounts, and I had all my money stored in the Cayman Islands. But that's BS. They can take it. Take my word for it. If you've got something, hide it, because they can go to any bank and take it." In January 1975, Lucas's house in Teaneck, New Jersey, was raided by a task force consisting of 10 agents from Group 22 of the U.S. DEA, and 10 New York Police Department detectives attached to the Organized Crime Control Bureau. In his house, authorities found $584,683 in cash. He was later convicted of both federal and New Jersey state drug violations. The following year, he was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Once convicted, Lucas provided evidence that led to more than 100 further drug-related convictions. For his safety in 1977, Lucas and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program. In 1981, after 5 years in custody, his 40-year federal term and 30-year state term were reduced to time served plus lifetime parole. In 1984, he was caught and convicted of trying to exchange 1 ounce of heroin and $13,000 for 1 kilogram of cocaine. He received a sentence of 7 years and was released from prison in 1991. Lucas's life was dramatized in the crime film American Gangster, in which he was portrayed by Denzel Washington. Lucas was often on set during the filming providing advice, for example on how he carried his gun. In his last years, Lucas was confined to a wheelchair due to a car accident which broke his legs. Lucas died at the age of 88 on May 30th, 2019 in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. Rayful Edmond III. Edmond was an American former drug trafficker in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. Edmond is largely credited with having introduced crack cocaine into the Washington, D.C. area during the crack epidemic, resulting in an escalating crime rate in the city which became known as the murder capital of the United States. Edmond was alleged to have moved large amounts of cocaine. He bought between 1,000 and 2,000 kilos per week in 1992 from the Trujillo Blanco brothers, who were associated with the Medellin cartel and sold the drugs to Washington area wholesalers. He was once known to have spent some $457,619 in an exclusive Georgetown store. Edmond's estimated revenue was approximately $300 million annually. In 1 year, Edmond's organization, which employed 150 people, committed 30 murders. Edmond was arrested on April 15, 1989, at the age of 24. His arrest and subsequent trial were widely covered by local and national media. Judicial officials, fearful of reprisals from members of Edmond's gang, imposed unprecedented security during the trial. Jurors' identities were kept secret before, during, and after trial, and their seating area was enclosed in bulletproof glass. The presiding judge even barred the public from the trial in an effort to protect the jury. Edmond was jailed at the maximum security facility at the Marine Corps base Quantico in Virginia and flown to the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. by helicopter each day for his trial. Edmond was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. His mother, Constance Bootsy Perry, was sentenced to 14 years in prison for participating in his criminal enterprise. Several of his sisters and cousins also received sentences. In 1996, Edmond and another drug dealer from Atlanta named Lowe were convicted after conducting drug business from a federal prison phone. Edmond received an additional 30-year sentence. In 1996, federal authorities revealed that Edmond had become a government informant. With Edmond's cooperation, the government arrested 11 alleged drug dealers working in Washington, D.C. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed to seek a reduced sentence for Edmond's mother. Edmond is still incarcerated but is now part of the United States Federal Witness Protection Program. The prison where he is held has not been disclosed by the government. Demetrius Holloway. Black Mafia family boss Demetrius Big Meech Flannery was born and raised in Detroit and was America's most notorious dope boss of the last 3 decades. In April 1980, Holloway went to federal prison for a robbery conviction and came out in 1985 ready for action. Within a matter of months of walking free, Holloway planted his flag, building a mammoth wholesale cocaine operation with reach into every nook and cranny of the business in the state of Michigan. The multi-tiered organization would grow even bigger in the years to come. Holloway's drug empire was vertically integrated and cloaked in a web of shell companies, real estate holdings, and offshore banking protections. At its peak, DEA records estimated he was moving hundreds of kilos per week across the Midwest. He recruited the Four Towering and Brutish Brown Brothers crew to be his enforcement wing. Always having a jet on standby, Holloway frequently went on lavish gambling spree weekends in Las Vegas and Atlantic City, famously winning or losing millions at the dice and blackjack tables in single sittings. Him and Maserati Rick were childhood friends with pro boxing champion Tommy Hearns and would travel with him and his entourage to fights. The Detroit Police Department considered him the most powerful dope boss in the city at the height of the crack epidemic and dubbed him Public Enemy Number 1. Holloway's kingdom of cocaine began showing cracks late in 1986 as the Brown brothers branched out from muscle work to wholesale distribution and declared war on their former boss. On the afternoon of October 8, 1990, Holloway was shot in the back of the head as he was purchasing a pair of designer Ralph Lauren socks at the front counter. In the end, it didn't go well, and it never does for those that cross into the life of drugs and crime. These men were exceptions, and the world is a better place with them gone. Let's hope this kind of evil never surfaces again. Until next time.